Welcome to the Truth Expedition. I'm your host, Mark Bishofsky. You've tuned into the program where we are going to dig for truth in this insane clown show, scary world where the fact checkers lie and the government and the media propagandize you and me, the citizens of this amazing world. Today, for reference, it is December 15th, 2023, and I'm joined, before we get to the guest, I'm joined again by two amazing co-hosts today. David and Gunnar are here with me to ask the questions today, and I am blessed. How are you guys doing today?
I'm great. Thanks, Mark.
Doing great. Excited for our guest today, Ken. He's a real powerhouse in this industry, so excited to hear what he has to say.
Yeah, so I'm just going to bring him right in. We're casual here. So our guest today is Ken McCarthy, he's got a history. He was a pioneer when it comes to internet and marketing, and he's been digging for truth since the late 90s, Brass Check TV. He's done some great work, and he's a repeat guest, our first repeat guest. We interviewed Ken about his book, Fauci's First Fraud, a few weeks ago, a couple months ago, and I will say, though I've never met Ken and shook his hand, he's become a friend of mine. And he asked me to help contribute to his work in this important, one-of-a-kind book that was just released, which is a collection of interviews, and I happen to be one of the interviewees in this book. This is information that needs to get out to the world, and this book is now available on Amazon. And Ken will talk about why it has to be on Amazon. But thanks so much, Ken, for joining us again.
Well, thanks for having me, and also for the kind words. I feel the same way, by the way, that I have you as a friend. I'm very happy about that.
Yeah, it's incredible where the path leads and the people you meet, and I feel extremely blessed. I know I said at one point, I think when you interviewed me, in a perfect world, I would have never met Ken, and but you know, it's not a perfect world, and one thing led to another, and I find myself here with amazing co-hosts and guests. But yeah, so this book, What the Nurses Saw, is a collection of interviews with whistleblowers, nurses, and others, respiratory therapists, in describing the stories, the facts of what they saw in the hospital, the crimes and the corruption, the hospital murders from their perspective. There's nothing else like this. This is a first of its kind, and it needs to be read by the masses. And so we're going to get into this book in a minute, but I thought I'd start with like a little political conversation, Ken. Where did you find yourself politically? Like I personally grew up in a Democrat union family. My dad was a union welder. I was, kind of just told, Democrats are good. And as I went through life, I discovered government's not good, and I found myself becoming a conservative, if that's what you want to call me. But did you have any kind of evolution like that?
Similar but different. My family was they were conservative Republican, strangely enough. The thing that two things woke me up. One was the Vietnam War. I was born in 1959, so I was conscious and sentient while that war was going on. And, as a child, I originally thought, well, we're at war. It's like World War II. It's a good thing. And then I started to learn the truth, and I realized, my God, this is horrendous, and they've been lying to us about everything. And I also have been interested in the Kennedy assassination for a long time. I mean, I can remember the first book I read on it. I must have been 12, and the hair on the back of my neck went up when I realized they killed this guy. It wasn't what they told us. So that was the beginning for me. So, and then I've had enough interaction with government to know that government is not here to help. They are here to butter their own bread, and we have to watch them very carefully and manage them as best we can.
Yeah, absolutely. You guys got some questions here? I'm going to turn it over to the co-hosts here.
So I actually would like to discuss what we had talked about Sunday night, Ken, at our meeting, the Mask Off Minnesota meeting, with all of our family members who were sharing their stories, heartbreaking stories. Of some of them were survivors, but not most of them. Most of them were the family members of deceased loved ones who lost their lives in the hospitals due to the protocols. And it was heartbreaking. It was infuriating. One thing I did come to realize afterwards, it's kind of like, the icing on the cake is, all these people, they were killed by the hospital protocols and also labeled as COVID deaths. So not only were they murdered, but also they used their numbers to contribute to the stats to help contribute to the overall fear campaign of so many deaths today, so many new cases today. That's all that fear propaganda really got us going back in 2020, and that's why everyone complied with masks and all social distancing and then the vaccines, of course. So that was a real eye opener for me, Ken, to see the family members' perspective, and of course the perspective of the nurses in your book also is a huge eye opener. But I was wondering, what was the most surprising thing that you heard? Because I know you've interviewed all the nurses for the book, for the whistleblowing nurses, but this is the first time you actually heard from family members of the victims. What was the most surprising? What were some of the most surprising things that you heard from that discussion that evening?
I'll get to that in a second, but I want to comment on one thing. You made the good point that not only did they kill these people, they used them to pump up their stats, to pump up the terror. They also declared that some of these people who died were anti-vaxxers. And this is something that, and I've been on 2 long calls with family members now, the one with you and then and another one the following day. So I might be mixing, where I heard it from, but we all had a suspicion that people that did not get vaccinated were not going to be treated well in the hospital. And one thing that's come clear as day, the people who went to the hospital who their records said were not vaccinated were absolutely abused, verbally, emotionally, psychologically, and then it led to the physical abuse and murder. And murder may seem like a really strong word, but when you deliberately withhold, if you're in the position of being a doctor or a nurse, and you deliberately withhold known remedies for an ailment, or you put treatments on somebody that you've seen kill people for weeks, months, even years, I don't know what else you would call that. But one of the things that surprised me talking with the nurses was that we focused on ivermectin and other things, vitamin D, vitamin C. But what the nurses told me is not only were vitamin C and vitamin D and ivermectin banned, ibuprofen was banned in the ICUs and in the emergency rooms for people that were diagnosed as COVID. They were not allowed to have ibuprofen, which is Advil. And this flies completely in the face of all medical, experience. Ibuprofen is an anti-inflammatory. It's not controversial. It's not strange. Inflammation is inflammation. There's no special, kind of inflammation. Inflammation is inflammation, and you want to get it down if you can. And they denied people ibuprofen. Another treatment, and Mark would know better about this, but sometimes people with respiratory distress are treated with a kind of steroid. And again, this is not controversial. This is not new. This is not untested. This is not unscientific. This was the norm in American hospitals. This was how you did it. So one of the many things that amazed me when I actually talked to the nurses is not only did they force remdesivir on people, not only did they put people on vents who should not have been at vents and on vents and then neglect them, they also denied very basic early treatment, uncontroversial early treatment. Nobody can say that ibuprofen is controversial for inflammation. And this steroid that's used for lung distress, nothing controversial about it. So they were literally, I learned another way they were setting people up to be killed.
Yeah, that medication is Pulmicort or budesonide. And before the pandemic, it was given out like candy. Anyone who had inflammation in the lungs. In fact, millions of people are on that medication prophylactically daily. Anyone with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD or emphysema, is on the medication daily. And what we saw is that those people that were on it prophylactically, you'd think they would be the most susceptible to this disease. They're elderly with lung disease. None of them were coming in and getting sick and dying because they were on Pulmicort, and they wouldn't even use this medication that is $10 a week. It's effective, and it has no side effects, but you couldn't use it. So those are my comments on that. But I'll turn
It's
it over.
great. It's so great to have you on this call. Oh, that's your show. But because like I'm not a respiratory therapist. I don't work in an ICU. So it's great to be able to talk. That was one of the great things about this book, to be able to talk to the people that were there. And the thing I want to make a point about is Mark, you've got, I think it's 20 years experience in your profession.
24.
Yeah, okay. 24, sterling reputation. Many of these nurses, 10 years, well, all of them, I think, 10 years, well, not all of them, but most of them, at least 10 years. And one 40 years with a PhD who was a nursing educator. So these are not new grads. These are not instant experts. These are not people that don't have hands-on experience. And in other words, they're not CNN newscasters. They're actually people that have been doing the work. And so it was great to talk with them and get into the fine points, because until this book, nobody got in written form or even in podcasts, as far as I know, or articles, nobody got into the mechanics of how you would normally run an ICU, how you would normally address people with inflammation, with respiratory distress, how you would normally treat people who have an infectious disease. They tried to tell us that COVID was never before seen in the history of mankind, in the history of the universe. Well, okay, maybe it's a variation of something that we've never seen, but we know what inflammation is. We know what respiratory distress is. These are not new things. So it was great to talk with people that have been treating these disorders successfully for decades, who could comment on why did they not treat the people properly.
Yeah.
Ken, let's dive in a little bit to the mechanics here. I know one of the things that surprised me about this book was the description of medical kidnapping, where folks go to the hospital, say that they're nervous, and they have COVID-like symptoms. They're given some anti-anxiety medication, and then they're kind of they're hooked into the system because they've had this anti-anxiety. They're allowed to hold them. Many of these people have, the course of ending up on an intubation, and they ultimately pass. Can you describe the process of medical kidnapping and sort of what happens there?
Gotcha. Believe it or not, medical kidnapping is a term that's been around for a while, and it manifests itself in a lot of different ways. But here's how it manifested in this particular circumstance. So you pointed out correctly, somebody comes in, maybe they're short of breath, they've been locked in their house, being inundated with a terror campaign, propaganda campaign, and they think they've got COVID. They go to the emergency room, they get a test, they're shown to be positive for COVID. Now they're in the machine. Now they're obviously upset. And the first thing some of these people would say to these patients was, "You seem a little upset. Would you like something to help you relax and feel better?" Well, let's say I'm in the hospital. I don't know any better. I am very upset. Here's this kindly person offering me something to feel better. I take it. The moment you take that, you are now in a new legal category. So let's talk about that legal category. All right. Hospitals generally can't just, send vans around and pull people off the street and hold them hostage. Not yet. I'm not being facetious. Our New York State governor here has put a law in place that actually enables that. That's a whole nother show. They now want to be able to hold anybody for any length of time for any disease, known or not known, diagnosed or not diagnosed, proven or not proven. So this crazy thing that I just mentioned is actually the foundation is being laid for it. But let's go back to COVID. So hospitals are not allowed to just snatch people off the street. They're not allowed to snatch people that come through their doors. They need a legal reason. And potential harm to yourself or others is a legal reason. Once they've conned you into taking a sedative, they can now say this person was agitated and was potentially at risk, so we sedated him or her. And now they supposedly have the law on their side and can say, therefore, we can hold this person indefinitely. So that's how the game begins. So lesson number one for everybody out there, when you're in an ER for any reason, unless you're in absolutely mind-bending pain, do not take the sedative that they're offering. because that gives them legal what they believe. I mean, maybe a judge and a court would find differently, but meanwhile, you're stuck in the hospital. So that gives them the legal, quote, right to hold you against your will. Now, remember the other part of this, which is so important, which we must never forget, is that family members, friends, advocates, you name it, were barred and banned from the hospitals. So nobody could go to the ER with you. Nobody could sit in the ER with you. Nobody could talk with you as the doctor was giving these grave pronouncements or offering you sedatives. So this was another very important part of the setup. The third big piece of the setup, of course, was this blanket immunity that everybody treating COVID was given. You know, whatever you do, it's okay. We'll see how that holds up in court as time goes on. But that's what laid the foundation for getting people in the door and locking them in. And of course, money, they were paid. This surprised me, and I got this from our forensic accountant, who has decades in healthcare, AJ Dupree. She was in the book. That different states had different payouts for COVID cases. And we were all looking at New York State and California State, where it's like $12,000 or $14,000. Some states, based on weird formulas, were paying out $100,000 and more for every COVID case.
Wow.
So they are now really motivated to find that you have COVID and get you in the hospital.
Ken, one of the things you also mentioned was this the Patient's Bill of Rights, and how that's largely been suspended. Can you speak to that? What's the status of that across many hospitals in the region, in the country?
Well, if anybody remembers being in a hospital pre-COVID, everywhere there used to be these patient Bill of Rights statements. They were in the elevator, they were in the lobby, you were given one when you checked in. It was a big deal. Now, I have not been in a hospital since COVID started, so I don't know the state status, but I'm told that those postings are disappearing from hospitals. And I got this from a call, and I believe it was the second call that I did after the one I did with David. And there's a lady down in Alabama. She says in her hospital, you have to go through a medical detector and get a mug shot before you are allowed to visit somebody in that hospital today. And of course, we're recording this in December 2023. So that's obviously a form of intimidation. It's, you know, it's like going, I mean, it's literally like going to visit a prisoner in a penal institution. In this one instance. Now, different states, different counties, different hospitals are going to be different, but the trend clearly is they want to make that Patient's Bill of Rights thing disappears. Now, the Patient's Bill of Rights is unfortunately not in the Constitution. I have to do some digging in to find out the history of that, but I can tell you this: it was in every hospital in America, and it was part of every intake process of every hospital that was operating normally and ethically.
And Ken, I want to just point out too that Minnesota also has a similar quarantine law that you mentioned as New York does. So a lot of people in Minnesota don't realize that, but we also have that, where the Minnesota Department of Health can determine that you're sick of anything, and they can determine to quarantine you for an unlimited amount of time. But I'm just curious, you know, Ken, we talked a lot about on our call Sunday night with all the families, a bit about, I should say, about the asymptomatic patients who, you know, basically had no symptoms but tested positive with the PCR test that we all know is not very reliable, and then were put on vents and put on remdesivir that you know, killed their lungs and killed their kidneys. I'm just curious, you know, when you look back at all this, and we also, as you just pointed out, you know, we determined that these folks were also labeled as COVID deaths as well, so it contributed to the fear campaign. Do you think, in all the money, financial incentives that you just alluded to, do you think all these protocols were all set up, you know, by design to kind of encourage all this nonsense on us?
Well, you know, without having the absolute smoking gun, I can't say 100%, but I can't imagine how it could be any other way. I mean, if you see a plane flying in the air, I may not have seen the factory where that plane was built, and I didn't watch it get built, but I know somewhere there was a factory and there were a bunch of guys sitting around with blowtorches, you know, and wrenches putting that plane together. So that's my answer to that. If somebody said you have to give your opinion, you know, one way or the other, clearly this was all premeditated. There's no other. What else could be done? Because not only were these protocols and these systems of intimidation and coercion put in place, um, but they also had a program in place to go after anybody that questioned it. So there were some doctors, ICU doctors that came out early. Of course, Nurse Nicole and Nurse Erin Marie came out really early. Uh, and those people were hunted down and they were fired. Some of them had their licenses challenged and taken away. And then through a group, and this is an important story, called Team Halo, which is literally endorsed by the UN. And I actually have the video of the Undersecretary of Communications of the UN endorsing Team Halo. This group went out and they set a hit list of any nurse or doctor or anybody that was getting prominence in questioning the protocols, and they unleashed masses of trolls, I would call them thug trolls, insults, threats, death threats. Some of these nurses were doxxed, which means their home address and telephone number was given out. And there were terrible consequences. They were receiving just the most horrific mail, photographs, pictures of their children with put over pictures, terrible pictures mailed to them from these people. And this group was endorsed by the UN. TikTok worked hand in hand with the UN to give all these people who were members of Team Halo a special white labeling on TikTok, so none of their posts were ever taken down. So the system not only included planning this thing out, planning all the financial incentives, but it also included making it crystal clear to every hospital and hospital administrator, you will enforce these protocols. Somehow they all got the message that these protocols were going to be enforced even in the face of watching person after person after person die. And then the third leg of this was they had a system in place, a well-organized, well-oiled machine to go after anybody who blew the whistle on it. So, next time a plane flies above you, ask yourself, was that plane manufactured in a factory, or did it spontaneously, accidentally appear and start flying around?
Yeah, it's so incredible. I would say this book, there's so much with the Scamdemic. There's so many rabbit holes you can go down. But I mean, this is the most thoroughly documented accumulation of evidence of what happened inside the hospitals. Covers everything from the ventilation, the medications, the doctors doing cookbook medicine. They no longer had to think. I mean, literally anyone could come off the street and do what the doctors were doing, because all you had to do is read an algorithm. If this, then do that.
Can I I'm sorry to interrupt you,
Please
Mark,
do.
but this
Please
raises
do.
a really interesting point, which was really surprising. I had gotten an indication from Erin Marie early on that they had brought in inexperienced nurses and doctors. What I hadn't realized was how incredibly bad it was. And I got that. And remember, Erin Marie she and I talked really early, so it took a long time for this information to come forward and to consolidate. But here's what they were doing. They opened the doors to doctors from any country. Now, there might be a doctor out here who was brilliantly trained in Hungary or in Germany or Poland, and they moved to the United States and they wanted to practice medicine, and they were told, well, you can be a janitor until you jump through 10,000 hoops to get the license to practice in this country. Okay. Well, what they did with COVID, in addition to setting up special COVID only wings, which we really need to talk about, please remind me if I forget, is they opened the gates to any doctor from anywhere in the country. Now, how much due diligence can you do? And I don't want to single out any country, but how much due diligence can you do on a doctor from Bangladesh?
Yeah.
Oh, how fast can you do it, right? So they brought in doctors that were not licensed in the United States to run these COVID wards. They also brought in doctors, and this blew my mind, who had never had any ICU experience at all. So when Mark is saying you could take someone off the street and just hand them the checklist of things to do, that's pretty much what they were doing. Now, because being a doctor, being an MD, even a practicing doctor, even an experienced doctor, does not make you multifaceted. And I always say this to people that don't understand that. If you have, let's say you need open heart surgery, you do not go to a podiatrist, right? He's not going to have a clue how to help you. So not only did they bring in foreign doctors, many of whom had a lot of trouble with English. They, by the way, they paid them insane amounts of money. Nurses in New York City alone contract nurses were being paid $10,000 a week. That's over $500,000 a year for anybody who needs the math. And I needed a calculator for that myself. That's what the nurses got. What did the doctors get? So they were coming from overseas. They were not licensed in the United States, and many of them did not have qualifications to be in those ICU units. There were gynecologists, there were obstetricians, there were podiatrists. Now, on the nursing side, I had heard that they were putting new graduates into the ICUs. Now, that is really bad because a nurse has to go through the book learning, then has to go through the practical learning in a specialty. Again, nurses are specialists. You can't take any old nurse and just put her in the ICU. It's not going to work. But they did that, and they did that with recent grads who did not have experience of any kind. All they had was book knowledge. And then when I got to talk with Nicole, and Nicole's interview is one of the ones that I did recently, relatively recently, she said it's worse than that, Ken. They brought in nursing students that hadn't even gotten their nursing degrees yet. And to use a plain analogy, that's like taking some random person from the back seat of a plane, putting them in front of the controls of the 747 and say, land this baby for us. Literally, I'm not exaggerating. And you know what, please, it's so great we have Mark here. Mark, can you take somebody, even a doctor, let's say they have an MD, a PhD, 50 years of practice as an obstetrician. Can you put them in charge of a vented patient safely?
No, you can't. I mean, a pulmonologist, like, I did contribute to the book. There's a chapter in here from my story, but a pulmonologist, like Dr. Pierre Corey, who I happen to be working for right now, little tidbit there, he would understand. Pulmonologists, ICU hospital doctors would understand how to run a ventilator. But no, a podiatrist, any other kind of a doctor, a doctors that work with skin or GI or specialize in any other part of the body, they're going to have no clue. I mean, a little bit more than the average person might have when it comes to a ventilator, but no, you need to, it's complicated, and you pretty much need to be a pulmonologist or an ICU intensivist.
I mean, let's see, even to make this even a fairer comparison. Let's say somebody has flown a Piper Cub, right? They're a small plane operator, so they know a little bit about planes. I don't think there's an airline in America that would put that person in the cockpit of a 747 and tell them fly to England. So even intelligent people that have been around the medical world, they're just not equipped. They're not prepared. Now, we have an expert on respiratory therapy on the call, but we also have an expert on magic. And I want to talk about another important element of this, which is misdirection. And since we have a magic expert on the call, David, could you explain to people what misdirection is? And then I'll explain how they used it in this COVID catastrophe.
I'd love to, yeah. So typically, magicians use misdirection, obviously for entertainment purposes, but the concept of misdirection is, the basic concept is, while you're looking over here, we're doing something secretive over here that you're not noticing. That's the general basic concept. And because your attention is taken away, we're able to do it quite easily sometimes using misdirection, doing whatever we need to do secretly over here.
Gotcha. So look at this hand. Let me see. Look at this hand, and then with this hand, you're picking their pocket or something.
Exactly.
Misdirection. We're recording this in mid-December 2023. This catastrophe has been unfolding now for over 3 years. I don't know how many millions, maybe it's billions of words have been spent on the subject of COVID. We know that there are more than a few groups that have raised many millions of dollars to act as resistance fighters against this madness. And yet this topic that we're talking about on this call has been completely overlooked. Now, the family members and the people that somehow miraculously survived, they know it happened. But you're not going to find a podcast, you're not going to find a book, you're not going to find an article, you're not going to find a nonprofit that has made this a cause. Now, why is that? And I'm glad we have David. This is so great. It's a thing called misdirection. So they had us focused on, first of all, how easily this thing spread, how lethal it was, how everybody was going to die from it. So that caught our attention. That was a bit of misdirection. Then they started shutting down businesses and schools. Well, that focused our attention, right? Suddenly we're not going to school. We're going out a business if we're a business owner. All these local shops that we depend on were closed. Then they put the masks on us, right? And that became, understandably so, a huge subject of discussion. And we were all waiting and we're all fighting about masks, people like me who did not wear and would not wear a mask, and all the other people that would. There was a big, ongoing war about that. So they had all these things going. And at the very same time, they were killing patients by the boatload in hospitals across America, and I would say in the Commonwealth, in Canada, in the UK, Australia, New Zealand, any hospital system that got caught up in this thing, probably Europe too. I'm not as familiar with Europe. We don't have any European experts at this point, but it was all misdirection. And then of course we had the vaccine wars. Are you going to get it? Are you not going to get it? Will people be able to go to school? Can they keep their jobs? And everybody was focused on that, and rightly so. And nobody was looking at this issue. I interviewed Nurse Nicole in earlier, either early summer or very late spring of 2020. And I interviewed a fellow from the UK with 40 years of experience as a nurse and a PhD nursing educator, also an educator in physics, in ethics, medical ethics. And I thought, okay, one of these multi-million-dollar nonprofits, one of these investigative reporters who's on the YouTube all day and night is going to pick up what these nurses are saying and do something with it. So nothing happened in 2020. Nothing happened in 2021. Nothing happened in 2022. Nothing was happening in 2023. And I realized no one's going to do anything about this. So thus I'll hold it up. So this is what this is about. That's how this book got produced. So it was the greatest crime, well, it's hard to say what the greatest crime was. I mean, depriving children of development opportunities from being in school, depriving elderly people dying from seeing their loved ones and dying alone. I mean, forcing people to get vaccines who didn't need them, who were then injured and crippled or killed. It's hard to say what the worst crime is, but one of the biggest crimes was what went on in the hospitals. And let's look at the math. 1 million people, more a little bit, but we'll use simple numbers. 1 million people died in US hospitals, quote, of COVID. Over 900,000 of them died in the hospital. We had a death rate of people dying from COVID in this country, in this super medicated country, that far exceeded a lot of other countries around the world. So clearly, just if you look at the numbers, something really, really bad went wrong. It could be tens of thousands, it could be hundreds of thousands of people. And who's looking into it? Are government agencies looking into it? Are news networks looking into it? I'm hoping these nonprofits that are collecting millions of dollars every year to act as the resistance, I hope they're going to look into it. Yeah, I am kind of calling them out. Who's looking into this? This is not the job of one person. This is a job of a team and a group of people that have a lot of money. We need to know how many people were given remdesivir. We don't even know. I don't think we even have that number. We need to know how many people died of remdesivir. We need to know how many people were intubated and put on a vent. We need to know how many people died of that. And then we need to see the medical records. And, I'm a bit of a history buff, and when COVID started, I went and looked at all the stuff related to the Nazi medical system, and the way those and by the way, they had a trial called the Nuremberg doctors trial, and I think they had a total of 12 or 14 people on it. Well, by my calculation, there were tens of thousands of Nazi doctors and nurses working in the many, many, many labor camps. There were over 20,000 internment centers and sites in Europe during World War II. It wasn't just the big name ones. There were 20,000. Each one of them had a medical center or a clinic at least, which meant you had a doctor and a nurse or more. These people were actively involved in killing people, and they only managed to get a handful of them on trial. But the way they caught the guys they did catch was the records, the medical records, because the Nazis, they liked to keep records. And one of our saving graces here is going to be, for every patient they killed, there is a stack of medical records that can be gotten that shows. I just talked to a lady last night. In 14 days, her father was put on 52 different medications, and he died. That's just one story. So these records are out there. They are gettable. Now, interesting, and we're going to do something about this. The hospitals are saying to these families, yeah, we've got the records. It's about 3,000 pages. We'll give you the first 1,000 for $1 each, and then you can get the rest for 50 cents. We'll do the math. That's thousands of dollars. So some people are having trouble getting the medical records. And this is an area where we're going to roll up our sleeves, and we're going to do something about this. And we're going to make sure that these people can get their medical records without having to take out a loan. So I've kind of been rambling here and going in all different directions, but that's, I'm going to stop and see if you have any more questions for me.
Yeah.
Well, Ken, we've got a big list of questions for you. I don't know if we'll get through all of them, but I do have another one for you. In terms of accountability, Fauci is going to be appearing in front of Congress soon, this week, next week. What would you like to hear him answer for?
Oh my God. It's simple. Where, when, and who sat down and made up these protocols which included denying tried and true medications. We're not talking about ivermectin even here. Tried and true medications like ibuprofen and steroids, and that push people towards remdesivir when remdesivir is a known dangerous drug, and push people into intubation and venting when Mark and any other qualified, experienced, ethical respiratory therapist can tell you venting is a last resort step. It's not something you do casually. So Mr. Fauci, Dr. Fauci, who made up that protocol, when and where? Second question, how did you disseminate it? And the other part of that is, and who came up with the financial incentives to deny people ibuprofen, push them to remdesivir, and push them to venting? Who did where? Because it happens somewhere in space. Just like a plane is there's a factory somewhere. You can find the address and go there. It happened somewhere. It happened at a particular group at a particular time, and there was a particular group of people working these things out. I want to know the answers to those questions, and that's going to tell us a lot.
Hey, Ken, speaking of liability, here in Minnesota, our Governor Walz, during the beginning of the scamdemic there in early 2020, signed an executive order giving, I think, most healthcare workers immunity from getting in trouble for something that they might have done. So I think that kind of, I want to get your thoughts on it. I think most governors signed something similar to this, to what our governor did in Minnesota here, basically removing any liability from healthcare workers during that time. So I imagine that means if someone puts a person on a ventilator and they die, we can't hold them liable for that. Are you aware of any of that being signed in other states as well?
Well, let me, in New York for sure, sounds like Minnesota for sure, but let me talk a little bit about infrastructure. So you have the governor, and these guys are idiots. They're liberal, they're liberal arts grads. I don't mean to put down every liberal arts grad. Maybe they went to law school. Maybe they have a degree in political science. They don't have any scientific or medical basis to decree anything. So they have public health advisors. I don't know what it was like, and we need to know who these people are, and we need to know what their background was. The guy who called the shots for Cuomo here in New York State, and every state needs to figure this out. He was a pediatric cardiac expert, especially in anesthesiology. Okay, that's his expertise. Fair enough. The world needs people like that, right? He had no expertise in infectious disease, no expertise in respiratory illness, no expertise in anything relevant, in ICU, nothing. So yes, these are the guys that told the governors what to do, and they told the governors, give immunity. Now, who told these these public health directors to do that. Now, if you see my other book called Fauci's First Fraud, I make the point, and unfortunately, if you're going to commit a crime, commit a really, really complicated crime, because it's just hard to explain it to people. But you need this piece of it. Fauci made his bones, and that's an expression that people in the mafia use. After you kill somebody, you have made your bones, and now you are an accepted member of the organized crime group that you want to join. Fauci made his bones during the AIDS scamdemic epidemic. And just to cover this very closely but carefully, are there people who have catastrophic collapses of their immune systems? Absolutely. Is it a virus that causes it? Well, the guy that discovered the virus didn't think so. And the guy that invented the PCR test that was used to find the virus in people didn't think so. And many, 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 many other people, one of the most eminent virologists on earth, Peter Duesberg, didn't think so. So in any event, you're not allowed to say what I just said if you're a medical doctor and want to have a job. You're certainly not allowed to say that as a governor. You can't, they will be after you. This woke mob stuff, it's been around a long time. And one of the ways it got formed was back in the 1980s to push the AIDS hysteria. So basically, you can't be a governor, you cannot be a public health official in this country, federal, state, local, city, if you don't bend down and genuflect to the shrine of Anthony Fauci and his AIDS fraud. Now, you may not know what I mean when I say AIDS fraud. Get Fauci's First Fraud. It's going to lay it all out for you. But here's the thing, and I'm sorry to go off on a tangent, but the mechanism by which this occurred is knowable, and we can deconstruct it, but we have to ask the right questions. And the people that are posing as investigative, I'm not a journalist, guys. David knows this. I'm a businessman. I'm running businesses, but I had to do this. So the people who are posing as investigative journalists, I've just given them a clue of something that they could do. Find out who all these public health people were. Now, there's one other piece on the public health guy in New York. He was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And if people don't know what that is, it's like the Bilderberg Group. It's one of these super elite groups where they believe that they are the great anointed of the earth, and they're entitled to manage the planet for everybody else because we don't know what to do. So he is the guy that ran that and made that immunity decision in New York State, had no medical qualifications to make that immunity decision, and he is also 90% politician, global politician, and maybe 10% physician, if at best. So multiply that by 50 states, and I'm going to guess every single state, unless the governors were really smart, have that kind of immunity. Now, can that immunity be pierced? Well, we're going to find out, because immunity you can't murder somebody, literally, and get immunity for that. There is no immunity for murder. Okay, these guys weren't James Bond, licensed to kill. Normal mistakes, normal misfortunes, you were immune to that. You weren't immune to murdering people. You weren't immune to abusing people verbally. You weren't immune to giving people dangerous drugs without their explicit permission. In fact, not only without their permission, but against their stated wishes. There's no immunity for that, in my opinion. And again, I'd love to see some lawyers get on this, on these cases, and see if we can pierce this thing. Because here's my greatest dream is that the plaintiff lawyers of the world, and these are the guys that run the ads, have you been injured? Call this number. The day those guys can make a buck on this, it's going to be total warfare on this system. But we will see if we get there.
Ken, I wanted to read a message from one of our family members on Sunday night. It's from Stacy. I just think this is pretty interesting to hear what she has to say. This is after our discussion with all the family members who've described their loved ones in the situation with the hospital protocols. She says, "Hi, David. I wanted to thank you and Nicole for hosting the call last night. It is so important to get this atrocity exposed now. People are moving on, forgetting the people who died and were injured by the hospital protocols. It is easier for people to close their eyes and ears and move on than to acknowledge how messed up our medical system and government are. The trauma is real for those of us who have lived through this. My husband's hospital records are 6,100 pages. It is like a giant jigsaw puzzle and very difficult to make sense of. It is so hard to verbalize it all. The trust, the hope I had that Ron was being given the right care, even though in my gut I knew something was wrong. Our medical system has been hijacked. People need to wake up. Thanks again, Stacy. It really spoke to me when I read that message after our meeting there Sunday night. And I wanted to ask you, Ken, too. You mentioned about the nurses being attacked and the censorship and whatnot. And we also talked about earlier, do you think the protocols were designed by design? Do you think the censorship was planned? And the reason why I asked that for numerous reasons, it seemed like to me that almost anything that went against the narrative was to be censored. So, for example, we had Liz Collin speak at a Mask-Off meeting about a year ago. And in her presentation, she actually admitted that when she worked for CBS News, her news director specifically told her not to cover Dr. Jensen or anything about him. And at the time, Dr. Jensen was running for governor in Minnesota, and he was one of the first early whistleblowers as far as talking about the COVID deaths being exaggerated, financial gain, and all this stuff. But she was explicitly instructed by her program director at WCCO CBS to not cover him at all. So in my opinion, it does seem like a lot of the censorship was planned, and they even talk about that Event 201. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yep, you mentioned Event 201, and for people that watched the videos of Event 201, they absolutely had a session on how are we going to control the news in this. They were running a tabletop fantasy war game, and they wanted to lay out all the different pieces. And one of the pieces is, how do we control the news? So that was going on before COVID. And of course, propaganda is the oldest thing in the book. And there are tens of thousands of people employed full time. They get a paycheck every week in the military, in all the branches of the military, in all the branches of government. Fauci, I estimated, has, I think, 12 guys who are just directors of what they call it communications, but it's propaganda. That's Fauci's sub-wing of NIH. So all these federal agencies have numerous employees. CDC has is it right? Yeah, 200,000 square foot public communications and education facility in Atlanta. 200. I once bought a 50,000 square foot building, so I know how big 200,000 square feet is. Like, you need a lot of people and a lot of equipment to fill that thing, and that's the firepower the CDC has. All right. So there was a tremendous amount of firepower. We also know, and this is a recent revelation, and haven't had a chance to look into the details of this one, but it totally rings true, that there was a military corporate government group that got together in the March of 2020 to apply industrial strength PSYOPs, psychological operations, which are usually done against the enemy by our military, in support of the narrative. So yes, I think if you're going to rob a bank, you need a getaway car, right? So if you're going to do what these people did, you needed to have in place some kind of censorship. No, not some kind, an elaborate, massive censorship program in place. And, maybe it wasn't 100% ready, but the template was there, and all they had to do was add money, because there are PR firms, there are ad agencies, and David, you and I have talked about this. The state of Minnesota have spent millions and millions of dollars on their public health campaign. Multiply that by 50 states. There were thousands of people, I would call them useful idiots, working to promote this. And that was baked into the cake of this. You can't listen, I'll tell you this, you cannot have a war without propaganda. There's no such thing as a war without propaganda. Propaganda before the war, propaganda during the war, and propaganda after the war. It is as important as the bullets and guns. So absolutely. Now I want to say something too. These individual stories are literally heart-wrenching, and you can't imagine the horror these families endured, and you can't imagine the horror the people that somehow escaped endured. I mean, it is as bad as you can imagine. But I want everybody to keep clear on one point. These are not a handful of individual tragedies. This is thousands, tens of thousands. I'm going to guess, in absence of having hard research yet, hundreds of thousands of people that went through this. Joseph Stalin at one point said, if one person dies, it's a tragedy. If 1 million people die, it's a footnote in history. And this is another part of the formula that's going on here. So keep in mind, every time you see one story, you've got to multiply it by many, many, many thousands. There's one other note here that I have here. Okay, this is really important. This is maybe the most important thing on this call. People are still being killed this way as we speak. Okay. I made two mistakes in my book. One, in the subhead of the title, I made it sound like this is something that happened that we have to go back and look at. No, this is something that happened and is ongoing. When I talk with the medical justice families groups, they're saying, well, we just got another report. Not another report of something that happened months ago. Somebody that went into a hospital. And these are people that were skeptical of the masks, skeptical of the vaccinations, knew remdesivir was difficult, but somehow once they got in the clutches of the system, it was all over for them. Now, if that doesn't move you, let me give you something that might move you. This system has been completely undetected and untouched, right? My book appears to be the first touch that anybody's doing, all right? But this system is intact. They can put the key in the ignition and turn that engine on again tomorrow. They can declare a new pandemic. And they can use some of these different thresholds that these governors are cooking up. We think you might have been exposed to somebody who had a disease. Therefore, we're going to use our executive authority to seize you and hold you against your will indefinitely. And while you're there, we might give you a sedative and test you for the newest disease. Do you see where this is? So the most important thing about this call is to understand that this is not, we're not looking at dark history that we've gone through. This system and all the players, all the guys that are pulling triggers, all these doctors and nurses that are killing people are still in place, and they're still ready to do more.
Yeah, it's just like the TSA never went away after 9/11. This is not going away. We're going to live with this, and we have to stand up and fight. And we got about 5 minutes left. I'm going to have David ask one more question, but I just want to mention here, like Ken had said, Ken's not a journalist. He is on a mission to expose this. This book wasn't about money. This book is about telling a story that needs to be heard. You can get this book on Amazon. Private booksellers won't carry it because of the censorship machine. It's not expensive, like $15 on Amazon for this big book, at $3 for the Kindle version. You need to go there. You can also find Ken's work on brasscheck.com, all his other investigational work. But please do support this mission to get this message out. Buy one for your friends. They need to read this. So yeah, I'm going to turn it over to David for our last question here. We're running out of time, but I needed to mention that in case we ran out of time.
And Mark, it has pointed out to be a great Christmas gift as well. Christmas is coming up, so quick plug for Christmas gifts there. But anyway,
well, can I just say, I know it's kind of a strange Christmas gift, but I will say this: there is because I know a lot about publicity, and David knows this, and marketing. There is a tremendous opportunity between Christmas and New Year's. Everybody's at home, sitting at home in their pajamas, looking for stuff to do and talk about. So there's a lot that can be done. We have a website, by the way, whatthenursessaw.com, and the ordering information is there. But we also have some of the videos of some of the nurses, and a lot of the proof, the evidence that we put in the book. We've now put that you can look at, watch videos on that website, so you can both learn more about this and order the book. And I want to say one other thing: consider buying two. Consider buying more than two. We're trying to lift ourselves up in Amazon. And Mark said this is not a money-making venture. I have lost, just in this week alone, $5,000 because I wasn't taking care of my business and I was promoting this book. And I'm not going to brag or anything, but David knows what my time's worth. I've got well over 1,000 hours into this book and well over 3,000 or 4,000 hours into the total value, the total value battle. So yeah, it's not a moneymaker, but I do want you to buy boatloads of them. Give them to friends, give them to libraries, give them to public officials, give them to friends that you think understand this, give them to friends you think might be at risk. If the book does well, more podcasts, more books, and the most important thing is more people understand the problem we're facing, and we get some of these journalists and some of these nonprofit, fundraiser people to get in there and attack. This is their weak point. This is the most clear violation of humanity that these people have done. And when people, and as David can tell you and as Mark can tell you, when you get into the details of these people's stories, they're horrifying and they're undeniable. And we've got the medical records to show the torture these people were put through without rhyme or reason.
Well, I'm wondering, Ken, we have just about a minute left here, but Gunnar and Mark and I were wondering if we can come back to the COVID-only wings that you told us to remind you about. The COVID-only wings. Can you tell us about that?
Okay, I happen to know a lot about the history of special hospital wings. There was a real thing. A lot of people think this is a conspiracy theory. There was a thing called MK Ultra, and the United States government was really interested in understanding how they could exert mind control over people. So they would do things like, shock somebody with electric shock, 100 times in a row and see if they could erase their memory and give them a new memory. I'm not exaggerating. This is all documented. And they would pick, people that were on the street, maybe they were homeless, and they think, well, no one's going to care about this guy, or they'd find people that didn't have family members, and they would treat them. Okay. There wasn't one hospital doing this. There were scores of hospitals, and they all had a special wing, in some cases a special floor, where they were getting money from the federal government to run these experiments. And if anybody thinks I'm making this up, in 3 seconds on the internet, on Google and the internet and whatever, you're going to see that this, and nobody denies that this happened anymore. So hospitals have a history, and they know exactly how to set up special wings. Okay. And I want to ask Mark a question because, I'm only just sorting this piece of it out now. In many hospitals, it appeared the normal, regular doctors and nurses and even respiratory therapists, in some cases, were not even present in these wings, or they were present in minuscule or dilute form, and that the actual COVID wings were run by these contract doctors and contract nurses who, as I pointed out before, had unbelievable financial incentives to do as they were told and didn't know anything about being in an ICU. Mark, every hospital is different, every state's different. Did you get any sense that there was anything carved off from the normal hospital? I mean, a lot of hospitals were turned into COVID only, which is a whole nother issue. But did you get a sense that there was something different about the way the ICUs were being run and who was staffing them? And in Minnesota, just curious.
Yeah, I was in a smaller hospital. We had about a 15-bed ICU, so it became the COVID unit. And then we had another section of the hospital that we turned into a COVID wing. Everything changed, all these, dozens of nurses were laid off, because all these, elective surgeries were stopped. So everything was different. But from my perspective, it was the same doctors in the same ICU. But I know what you're saying did take place, but I can't really comment on having that experience personally.
Gotcha. But I can tell you in the big, for instance, in the New York City public hospitals, which were large and which became converted into COVID-only hospitals, like I said, you had doctors from other countries, some of whom could barely speak English, most of whom didn't even have the proper qualifications to be in an ICU, nurses that had just graduated from school, had no ICU experience. So you basically not only had this sort of closed door and no witnesses. This was another piece of this. We brought it up earlier, but it needs to be. There were no witnesses. If you were a family member, if you were a pastor, if you were a lawyer, if you were a professional advocate, you could not get in there and see what was going on. And Mark, you can tell me this is unprecedented in medical history.
Absolutely. The last 3 years have been so bizarre, and it continues. They're still using remdesivir. Early intubation is faded, but ventilators are still being used. I mean, things have evolved for the better to a certain degree because we don't have the early intubation. But the playbook is still there.
They're still limiting visitors, though, too.
Yeah, limiting visitors. And, if a variant, a more virulent virus variant comes around, they're going to do the same thing. But we have to just not comply. If my family member's in the hospital sick, I'm coming in. You're going to need security, multiple security to keep me out, and there's going to be trouble. Yeah, so it's just the craziest thing. Unfortunately, we're out of time here. We have an interview coming up in a little bit here. We're going to interview one of the daughters of a patient who was killed in a hospital. So I appreciate your time, Ken, and everything you're doing in this battle.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. So we'll have Ken on again. Look for Ken's work at brasscheck.com, whatthenursessaw.com. Get the book. Go to Amazon. And thanks everybody for tuning in and being awake to what's happening in this world. Don't tread on me and don't shed on me.